The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Moving the Goalposts. On a recent episode of the Atheist Experience, someone called in to accuse me of having varying levels of skepticism, essentially practicing a certain amount of skepticism for the claims that I believe in, and a different higher level of skepticism for claims that I don't accept. This already demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding about skepticism. It's not about different levels. But what they accused me of was moving the goalposts. So what's that mean? And let's figure out whether or not I was doing it. So my apologies to anyone living outside the United States who may not fully understand American football, but I'm going to go ahead and go with American football for this example. It's not that important. This is all an analogy, and you can use the analogy in whatever way you want. But in American football, it's played on a 100-yard playing field. And because there's been a lot of games over the years, we have pretty good statistics about how likely someone is at the professional level to kick a field goal from a certain number of yards away from the goalpost. The important point, though, is that the goalpost is stationary. It doesn't move. When we evaluate the people's ability to kick a field goal, we take a lot of things into consideration. Was this done off of a tee? Once upon a time, they allowed you to prop the football up on a tee, and you could kick longer field goals that way. The NFL has since removed the ability to use a tee, but it may come up in other games. And we can look at it at the college level, at the high school level, etc., and figure out what's the likelihood from any given distance that someone is going to kick a field goal successfully. Now, within the NFL, the record for in-game field goals is somewhere between 60 and 70 yards, 63, 64, 65, something like that. I don't keep up with sports or football all that much, so I don't know what the record is, and it doesn't matter all that much. The point is that fairly close to the goal, 10, 15, 20 yards, something like that, the percentage that a professional kicker is going to make a field goal is pretty high. And you have to consider the fact that when we're talking about this in the context of a game, each of the teams has fielded a bunch of players out there who are trying to prevent this. So not only do you have distance and wind, and the physical abilities of the kicker to consider, but you also have to consider the strength of the defensive team, the strength of the offensive team, and all that. But we can put it all together in one little thing and say, here's what's actually happened in a game. Here are a number of examples of someone kicking a field goal 40 yards, 50 yards, 60 yards, 30 yards, 20 yards. And what's the likelihood? And so when we're evaluating how believable it is that a given kicker is going to kick a field goal from a certain distance in a game, we have a lot of statistics to run from. We know how many times it's been attempted, how many times it's been successful. We know this particular kicker's skill and abilities. We know things about the team. And therefore, we could place a bet from any given distance on whether or not someone's likely to kick that goal. Now, if we're watching the game and there's a kick from 20, 25 yards, something like that, it's an incredibly high likelihood, you can go look up the statistics yourself, that someone's going to be able to do that. And so that would be a fairly safe bet. What happens when you get 50 yards out? At 50 yards, does it instantly become a coin toss because we're halfway down the field? No. Is it a coin toss necessarily at any median point? Nah, it could be this incredibly nice curve of really high likelihoods of kicking a field goal at close range and vanishingly small ones at a longer range. In the entire history of the NFL, there's only been 20 some odd kicks from over 60 yards that made it, if I remember statistics from that. But the important thing is that the goalposts don't move. What changes is the nature of the kick. And so in this analogy, the goalpost should be considered achieving sufficient evidence to reasonably justify a belief. How likely is it that this claim is going to be true? How likely is it that this attempted kick is going to actually score a goal. And the goal is believability. Now, if you walk out on a field and kick a 75-yard field goal with nobody else on the team, just in a practice, well, now you've demonstrated at least that it's possible for human beings to kick a field goal from 75 yards, even though it's never actually happened in a game. What's that going to do to change the likelihood that someone is going to kick a field goal from 72 yards? Well, it certainly seems that it's more likely than 75 yards, but considering neither have ever happened in a game, it's incredibly unlikely that in a game scenario this is going to happen. I gave an example during the phone call of, let's say we had right now someone cut my head off, doctors examined me, I was clearly decapitated, we have reasonable ability to test in the modern era to show that I was in fact decapitated and dead, and at some point later we can show that my head's back on and I'm alive. This came from, in part, a debate I did with Mike Licona on the resurrection, and I like using this example because even the caller on Sunday acknowledged that in that scenario we would not have evidence to confirm how a resurrection took place, but we could at least agree that a resurrection took place. We would have sufficient evidence to say, yep, this happened, but we may not have any way to show how or why it happened. Was it some sort of natural phenomenon that we don't know anything about? Was it a technology that we don't know or understand? Was it supernatural in origin? And if it was supernatural in origin, what was the origin of this? Was it, some sort of mystical, magical thing, or was it a god? Was it fairies? Was it head restoring pixies? Any of those things. So the caller understands that this scenario, which I've set up as close to the goalpost as I can for a resurrection, is still something that we can't demonstrate what the explanation's for. And so I asked, why are you then so confident about a resurrection that comes from anonymous reports in ancient books where we can't investigate, where we have no empirical evidence to sort this out? And this is where he accused me of moving the goalposts. That for the resurrection that I hypothesized, somehow or another I set the goalposts up where he could clearly understand that we couldn't come up with an explanation for how something happened. But when it came to his preferred belief in a resurrection, all of a sudden I had moved the goalposts. The truth is, he's trying to cheat. The truth is that what we're evaluating is how far you are from the goalposts, not whether or not the goalposts move. The goalposts are static. The goalposts are, this is what warrants sufficient evidence. We now have sufficient evidence to warrant belief in this particular claim. And it's not my fault that you decided to set up a kick from 250 yards away, which is really what's happening when we start talking about things like proposed supernatural explanations for things that we can't even confirm. They're so far from the goalposts that they can't even see them. They can't even ensure that they're kicking in the right direction. It's just a story. Now, is it possible that in different areas I have a relaxed skepticism? Sure, I think that's possible. I think as human beings, we're all prone to our biases. But if you're going to call in to say, Matt, you're moving the goalpost to make it convenient for whatever beliefs you hold, then you'd better come with an actual example of that. And as soon as you do, I'll say, yep, that's a mistake. I shouldn't be moving the goalposts like that. But in this case, the caller said, here, let me give you an example, and then spoke for several minutes, and then realized that the example they were given wasn't me moving the goalpost, acknowledged that this wasn't an example of me moving the goalpost, and then tried to come up with a better example of it. So have I moved the goalposts? I have no idea. In any case where somebody could demonstrate that I've changed what my standards of evidence are for similar claims, that would be a problem and I would have to address it. But as we've pointed out many, many, many times, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and mundane claims don't. And so if you say, I can kick a field goal from the 20-yard line, well, that's not in and of itself particularly extraordinary. But if you claim that you can kick a field goal from the 100-yard line, that is extraordinary. And you might have to do considerably more to demonstrate that you can actually do this. If you show me a YouTube video of you kicking a goal or kicking a field goal from 100 yards, that may not be enough. We may want to see that, document it, have it independently observed, make sure that, there's no camera trickery involved or anything else. But if you just tell me, hey, I kicked a field goal from 22 yards the other day, I'm just going to take your word for it because there's nothing particularly extraordinary about that. On the other hand, if you say that you kicked a field goal from 20 yards away because aliens picked up the ball and using their minds made it do a triple loop through the air before it went through the field goal, well, now you've changed the nature of your claim. Not just because you have added aspects that we don't know about, but because the extraordinary nature of the kick has now changed as well, because there's twirls and swirls and all that other stuff. And yet there's nothing about the alien scenario that requires necessarily any violation of the laws of physics. It isn't supernatural in origin. You're claiming a technology that can do something that we can't understand. So when we talk about something like moving the goalposts, that would be like, hey, here's two claims that we consider roughly equivalent in their mundane or extraordinariness. And we need a certain quality and quantity of evidence for claim A, but we need 10 times as much evidence for claim B. That is where we're demonstrating a bias. If we acknowledge that the claims are coming from the same place, like two different people claim to have kicked a 22-yard field goal, and for one of them I take their word for it, and for the other one I want way more evidence, like I don't believe you, and there's nothing fundamentally different about the claims, that would be an example where you might fairly accuse me of moving the goalposts. But it's not me moving the goalposts when you decide to say that a claim of a kick from 100 yards is just as believable on the same evidence as a claim of a kick from 22 yards. It's not the fault of the goalpost or the opposing team or the individual who's considering and evaluating evidence that you've decided to accept a claim on poor evidence and then point to an easier claim. Well, that one made it. Why do you let that claim go through, but not my claim? My claim that once upon a time God came down and took human form and then sacrificed himself to himself to serve as a loophole for rules that he created, and that the temple shroud was ripped and that zombies marched on Jerusalem, and then he was buried, and 3 days later, in a massive confusion with stories that don't agree, we can know that there's an empty tomb and he was resurrected, and therefore all of this, even if it were true, wouldn't necessarily point to how and why it was done, but I'm going to go ahead and believe that it was all done by a God. You're not moving the goalposts. You're just kicking randomly out into an empty field and with no goal in sight, just claiming that you've kicked a field goal. So instead of being so eager to shout, "Goal!" which primarily is a soccer thing, how about we actually evaluate the claims honestly, and instead of just aiming in a random direction, claiming that you scored the winning field goal from 350 yards away when you have no idea where the goal is, we just acknowledge that it's not the fault of sound methods of epistemology that your claim is extraordinary. It is within the claim itself that we determine how extraordinary it is in relation to everything else we know in the world. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.